It was the summer of 1943, and the war had turned grim for Germany. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had finally surrendered. Thousands of German soldiers were captured and shipped across the Atlantic, their destination unknown. For many of them, the first sight of America was not the Statue of Liberty or a city skyline. It was the rolling fields of the Midwest, dotted with rows of barbed wire. Behind those fences were the newly built prisoner of war camps of the United States. They expected the worst. They'd been told that capture by the Allies would mean starvation, humiliation, or worse. Instead, they found something strange: civility. Each morning, the prisoners lined up for breakfast: bacon, eggs, fresh bread, sometimes even fruit. To men who had marched through dust and rationed dry biscuits, it felt surreal. They were treated by medics, given male privileges, even allowed to write home. The guards weren't cruel. They were mostly young men from Kansas or Ohio who simply wanted the war to end. But what surprised the prisoners most was how ordinary life seemed outside those fences. Trucks rolled by on nearby roads. Towns thrived. American workers laughed and smoked during shift. Changes. To men who had left a Europe shrouded in air raids and blackouts, the contrast was staggering. Inside the camps, prisoners worked chopping timber, maintaining farms, repairing roads. Some earned small wages in camp scrip, but a few, especially those with technical skills like mechanics or engineers, were given a different kind of assignment. One morning, a group of them were ordered to clean up and prepare for a trip. They were told nothing about where they were going. Just that they'd see something important. The guards kept quiet. The trucks rumbled north through farmland and small towns. None of the prisoners spoke much, though a few whispered theories. A new camp? Interrogation? Forced labor? No one guessed what awaited them. The convoy stopped outside a laboured, massive industrial complex, an endless grid of brick buildings, smokestacks, and steel cranes rising into the haze. The guards ordered the Germans out. As they stepped onto the pavement, the sound hit them first, a deep, rhythmic thunder that never seemed to stop. The air was thick with the smell of oil, metal, and heat. They were in Michigan, the industrial heart of America, and this was no ordinary factory. It was one of the plants producing the U.S. Army's most iconic vehicle, the Jeep. To the prisoners, the idea seemed absurd. They were engineers and mechanics themselves, men who had worked on Panzer's staff, cars, and armoured transports. They thought they understood machinery, but nothing they had ever seen in Germany prepared them for this. An American officer explained that they'd be given a brief tour under supervision. "You'll see how we make them," he said casually, as though it were nothing special. As the group moved inside, the German engineers began to exchange uneasy looks. In Germany, factories were often dark and crowded, their workers constantly disrupted by air raid alarms. Supplies were scarce. Bomb damage was a daily fear. But here in America, the lights blazed bright. Everything was orderly, clean, and efficient. Workers wore uniforms, not tattered rags. Conveyors carried parts in endless motion, and the roar of stamping presses was nearly musical, mechanical, disciplined, relentless. A foreman smiled as they passed. "We turn out about 1 every 3 minutes, he said, motioning toward the line. The translator repeated the number in German. The prisoners frowned, thinking they must have misheard. 1 jeep? Every 3 minutes? The foreman nodded, sometimes faster. For a moment no one spoke. They followed the group down the line. Chassis were moving along a conveyor. Men on either side installed wheels, engines, radiators, each worker performing one task with mechanical precision. To the Germans it looked like chaos. To the Americans it was choreography. But the true shock hadn't even come yet, because what they were about to see next would make even the most loyal among them understand that the Reich's war machine had already met its match. Inside the cavernous hall, the air shimmered with heat and noise. Sparks flew like fireflies from welding torches, and the floor vibrated under the weight of constant movement. It wasn't just a factory, it was an organism. Every part of it pulsed with purpose. Engines were lowered into frames with the precision of clockwork. Women in overalls tightened bolts and connected wiring harnesses, while men wheeled carts of components into place without missing a beat. Every station along the line was synchronized, one continuous river of creation. At first, the German prisoners tried to count how many jeeps were being built, but within minutes they lost track. The sheer volume defied comprehension. They had expected to see chaos, too many people, too little control. Instead, they saw a symphony. The most skilled among them former mechanics from the Panzer divisions studied the process with narrowing eyes. They noted the way every piece fit together, how the same wrench could be used on every bolt, how spare parts were perfectly interchangeable. That idea alone stunned them. In Germany, tanks and trucks often required custom fitting every vehicle, slightly different from the next. But here in America, the parts weren't just made for one Jeep, they were made to fit every Jeep. The prisoners watched as one Jeep rolled forward its olive, drab paint still wet, and a worker jumped inside, turned the key and started the engine. The growl echoed through the hall, drowned only by the next engine, starting moments later. Every few minutes, another completed vehicle rolled off the line, headlights flicking on for the first time. One prisoner turned to another and muttered half to himself. In Germany, this would take days. Another nodded slowly, unable to respond. The officer escorting them smiled faintly. "Gentlemen," he said, through the translator, "this is just one of several plants." The Germans stared in disbelief. Several? They had seen the weapon that would win the war, and it wasn't a tank, a bomb, or a new type of gun. It was the machine that built the machines, and that realization cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. The deeper the group went into the plant, the clearer the truth became. This was no isolated miracle. It was part of a vast industrial web that stretched across an entire continent. The American officer guiding them explained casually that similar lines were running in Toledo, Dearborn and Chester. Each factory built jeeps, trucks, engines, and spare parts around the clock, and while those lines never stopped, new ones were already under construction. The Germans listened in silence. In Germany, factories worked in darkness to avoid Allied bombers. Railroads were shredded, oil supplies collapsing. Workers were exhausted, machines broken, and fuel rations cut to almost nothing. Even tank production, the Reich's pride, had slowed under the weight of chaos. Here, the opposite was true. America's production was accelerating. Farmers were sending more food than they could eat. Women replaced men on the assembly lines. And civilian companies that once made refrigerators, sewing machines, or even toys, were now producing engines, munitions, and vehicles. The officer pointed to a sign hanging above the factory floor. "The will to win begins. Here for the prisoners." It was more than propaganda. It was truth made visible. The Jeep had become the symbol of that transformation. It wasn't glamorous like a tank or terrifying like a bomber, but it was the soul of Allied mobility, simple, rugged, reliable. It could climb mountains, cross rivers, and run for days, without repair. And America didn't just make them well, it made them by the hundreds of thousands. One of the POW engineers whispered to another, "If they can build this many jeeps, how many tanks, how many planes?" The officer overheard him, smiled, and said softly, "Enough." The word hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't arrogance. It was simple arithmetic, and the Germans understood arithmetic better than anyone. The war they had imagined, one of daring strategy, precision weapons, and elite soldiers, was gone. This was a war of numbers, steel, and endless energy, and in that war, America had already won. The prisoners walked along the moving track, their boots echoing on the concrete floor. They noticed how each worker performed one precise motion: tighten, align, inspect, move. Then another worker repeated the same action 100 times an hour, perfectly without hesitation. It wasn't mindless, it was mastery. To the Germans, who came from a culture that prized craftsmanship and individual skill, this approach was almost alien. In their factories, a mechanic built a vehicle like an artisan by hand, slowly, carefully. Every panzer, every truck bore the marks of its builder. But here, individuality didn't matter. The system itself was the craftsman. Every tool was standardized. Every part had a code. Every worker, from the foreman to the newest hire, understood exactly what came next. The prisoners noticed a woman in her 20s fitting steering wheels at lightning speed. She worked with a rhythm so smooth it looked rehearsed. When she dropped one by accident, another worker passed her a replacement without a word. The line never stopped. They had no idea that this same system was building not just jeeps, but B-24 bombers, Sherman tanks and Liberty, ships by the thousands. An American engineer guiding the tour explained how they used interchangeable assembly, a method refined from Henry Ford's original techniques. One prisoner leaned forward, watching as a part was installed. "Every bolt fits perfectly," he murmured in disbelief. The engineer smiled. That's the idea. For these men who had grown up in an industrial world, obsessed with precision but plagued by shortages, it was like watching a new civilization at work, one where logistics and creativity fused into unstoppable momentum. At one station, a worker paused only long enough to wipe his brow before hitting a switch. Instantly, a mechanical arm swung down, lifted an engine, and set it perfectly into the waiting jeep. The Germans stepped back, startled. "This is the future," one of them said quietly in his native tongue. The others nodded, and in that moment none of them felt like soldiers anymore. They felt like witnesses to a power that could not be matched. When the tour ended, the prisoners were led. Back outside, the roar of the factory faded behind them, replaced by the hum of the trucks waiting to take them away. The sun was setting over Michigan, painting the sky in red and gold. The Americans climbed into the front seats, laughing and lighting cigarettes. The Germans climbed into the back without a word. For the first time since capture, there was no defiance in their eyes, no bitter talk about Hitler's wonder weapons, no hope that some secret plan might turn the tide. They had seen the truth not in a battle, a report, or a propaganda leaflet, but in steel, sweat, and motion. On the drive back to camp, the convoy passed through small American towns. They saw children playing stores, open farms, running, and people smiling. Even in wartime, America still felt alive. In Germany, the lights were out, cities were rubble, fuel was precious, bread was rationed. Factories were buried deep underground to avoid bombs, cramped, suffocating, inefficient. One prisoner finally broke the silence. "Even if we win a battle," he muttered, "it will change nothing. They can build it all again." Another nodded slowly. "We can destroy 100 of their tanks. They'll replace them before we can count them." The officer in charge glanced back at the group, but said nothing. He didn't need to. Later, one of the German engineers, a man named Otto Kruger, told an American interrogator, "When I saw those jeeps coming off the line, I knew we had already lost. You can't fight a country that builds like that." Back at camp, the men returned to their bunks quiet and restless. No one sang, no one argued. They simply lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of American trains moving through the night, carrying they knew more machines of war to the front. In the years that followed, historians would call it the arsenal of democracy, the vast industrial heart that beat behind America's war effort. But for those German prisoners, it wasn't a phrase. It was something they had seen with their own eyes. That Jeep plant in Michigan had revealed the truth. The United States didn't just fight wars, it built the capacity to win them. Every engine that roared to life on that assembly line carried more than horsepower. It carried inevitability. Those prisoners returned to their camps, their pride cracked by something far more powerful than defeat on the battlefield realization. They had seen the endless supply of will energy and organization that no bomb or tactic could stop. When American soldiers later rolled across Europe in columns of jeeps, the same prisoners would whisper to each other in disbelief. "That's the same machine we saw born in Michigan," and they were right. Those vehicles carried medics into fire officers across battlefields and messages through chaos. They symbolized more than mobility. They represented an entire nation moving as one. Wars are often remembered for their heroes, battles, and strategies, but the truth is simpler. Victory belongs to those who can outbuild, outlast, and outthink their enemy. That summer of 1943, in a factory lit by sparks and steel, a group of German soldiers realized they were witnessing not just production but destiny. The sound of those engines wasn't just mechanical, it was prophetic. The war was already decided, and they knew it.